They have effectively conferred an immunity by delay on Donald Trump. He has gotten the immunity he sought. Let's be clear. There is nothing in the Constitution that gives presidents immunity. In fact, quite to the contrary, the text of the Constitution suggests presidents don't have immunity, since the legislative branch does explicitly have immunity that is not shared with the executive branch. But at least some members of the Supreme Court, by manipulating the calendar, by simply deciding to hear a case they didn't have to, and then sitting on how quickly that case got decided, they have granted Donald Trump the relief he sought, which is that there will be no trial before the November election. And that is a tragedy for democracy. It is a thumb on the scale. And frankly, it does nothing other than undermine people's confidence in the U.S. Supreme Court as neutral arbiters.
So 5 decades ago, the court took less than 2 months to decide President Nixon's case. They agreed to hear the case on May 31st, 1974. You see it there. They gave each set of lawyers 3 weeks to file their briefs, then 10 days after that to reply. The court heard oral arguments on July 8th, and just 16 days later, just over 2 weeks, they issued their unanimous opinion rejecting President Nixon's claim of executive privilege. In total, from start to finish, all done in 54 days. Just 54 days to decide Richard Nixon's case, and we are still waiting for the outcome of Donald Trump's after 112 days and counting. These are similar cases with similar urgency. President Nixon was making a completely ahistorical, unconstitutional claim of immunity because he did not want to turn over his tapes in the Watergate investigation. The court ruled no, the president is not a king and does not get to ignore the laws. Donald Trump is once again arguing the president is a kind of king, that he can do anything and everything, including ordering the assassination of his political rivals and not face prosecution unless impeached and convicted. And yet, the court drags its feet. Members of that court, all of them knowing full well, every day they delay makes it less and less possible that Trump will stand trial for the insurrection before this next election.
What would the debate be happening inside the Supreme Court about presidential immunity? And these delays are conscious, are they not?
They're certainly conscious, Mika, on behalf of at least some of the justices, particularly given their decision to schedule briefing in the way that they did. Before the break, John and I were talking about this schedule, and I was saying the delay itself is the win. Even if we see a decision, let's say tomorrow or Friday, that is a full victory for Jack Smith and his team, the damage will have largely been done. It's not clear whether the case can be tried in the time remaining before the election, or whether Judge Tanya Chutkan has the will to impose a trial on that schedule. You'll hear people complain bitterly, for example, that the Department of Justice policy forbids taking certain steps, certain number of days before election, whether 60 to 90 days. Read very clearly, that policy is about overt investigative steps like subpoenas or search warrants. It's not about a trial. But nonetheless, even if the Supreme Court were to hand Jack Smith a full victory, it's not clear that trial can be accomplished or if there is the will to make it happen.
Dave Arenberg, same question. What's the holdup?
A cynical person, Mika, would say the Supreme Court is putting its thumb on the scale of justice here, refusing to hold Donald Trump accountable for his actions. Remember, they could have intervened in December. Jack Smith saw this possibility and went to the Supreme Court and said, hey, why don't you come in now before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals rules, and let's get this out of the way. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's too early. Well, then, after the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals issued a very thorough, very powerful ruling, the Supreme Court intervened anyways, and that's why so many of us are just so upset about what happened, because the Supreme Court's supposed to be apolitical. This does not look apolitical. And yes, it looks like that Trump will not get absolute immunity, but he wins by losing, as Lisa said, by delaying this matter, by delaying the trial until after the election when he can become president and then call it all off. I do think it is likely, though, that the Supreme Court will issue a ruling that will send the case back to Judge Chutkan for some fact-finding to determine whether Trump's conduct falls within his duties of office and whether there's immunity. And so that'll mean that there is no trial before the election.
Do you believe it's taking an unusual amount of time? Are you suspicious of this?
Caitlin, I'm very suspicious of this. There's just absolutely no reason for it. It was 16 days from argument to decision in Nixon versus U.S., where they got the tapes from him. So there really is not a clear explanation of what's going on. You noted the number of decisions, important decisions that haven't been issued yet. There's a lot of administrative law kind of decisions which really are not as important in the bigger picture. They are to the litigants, but not to the fate of the nation as the one they're now sitting on for some 100 days. So there is not a good explanation at this point.
Yeah, and I think the other part of this is it is a historically sluggish court. The Wall Street Journal looked at this and noted that the justices here are completing decisions at the second slowest rate that we've seen from the Supreme Court since their 1946 term. And April was a very busy month for them. But I wonder, when you do look at this, how much of it is a matter of the process and making a big decision like this one versus, when people see it as maybe a political delay, as Leah Lippman is suggesting here.